economists are limited in their input. And the next speaker might have a good answer to that. Professor Sigrid Stagl from the University of Vienna in the area of socio-economics. I'm sorry, not not social. I'm sorry, that's socio-economics. And I believe, if I'm correctly informed, you were the first person in the US to have a doctorate, a PhD in sociology. So it means you've been dealing with these topics for a long time now. Sustainable working, integrated working methods. That's something that really fits with what we've just been talking about as well. So I'd like to hear your input on the European Green Deal and how we can understand it as part of a social transformation. Please welcome Professor Sigrid Stagl. Yeah. Hello. Good morning, everyone. Economists are often compared to dentists. Of course, you don't want to hear what they have to say, but not listening to them might have worse consequences. So often economists tell you different things as well. I work as an economist in the area of socio-ecology, and we see everything connected to a biophysical context. So nature has to be intact and society has to work correctly for this to happen. And so I've had a habit to start my presentations with a lovely image from space, with our fragile Earth as the blue planet, and it's something that helps us show what limits there are, what planetary limits there are. And now, if you look at this image, there's a green area in the middle, so that's where we might see no change, or a change that we can handle. There is no runaway effect, no increasing effects that we won't be able to catch up to anymore. So outside of that green area, especially in the area of climate, we're past that green area, especially in the area of biodiversity. We are losing a lot of biodiversity. We're far outside of the green area, which is very worrisome, and especially if we look at various chemical cycles, we are far from what is ideal, especially in the nitrogen cycles. For a couple of weeks ago, we had the new report from the IPCC, and others have spoken about it as well. It's been quite clear for researchers for 50 years now that these problems are accumulating, and what would happen if they did. So for 25 years now, we need 25 years of negotiations to come to the Paris Agreement, and research and science is very much in line with the previous reports in this report. And scientists, that's obviously a collective, there's thousands of them working on this. But if you look at the scientific results of the last couple of years, they've added to this cohort of information. And so this is a review, this is a contextualized piece of information. Something that they have managed is to very clearly word their ideas. In general, they're quite conservative in their estimations, potentially a little bit too conservative or a little bit too timid in their wordings. And this year they were quite clear in their wordings. And the problematic areas are large. It's clear that the human race has heated up the oceans, the chorosphere, and the biosphere. Everything, all this you can read in previous reports as well, but they've become much more clear in their wording this time. And we can see this in the data, human influence to increase, the heat of climate has been something that is very visible over the last couple of decades. Obviously, there's also natural change, but it's quite clear that human activity is linked, and it's not something that's only happening in the future. Probably it's something that's happening currently in all areas of the world. In red, you can see here those areas of the world that have hot extremes. That's extreme hot days. And then Western Central Europe, for example, here you can see is very affected by this as well. And then heavy precipitation, you can see the data on that. A lot of regions are already affected. And then here, agricultural and ecological drought. These are drought periods that directly affect our food systems. And here you have the references. And so that's a change in climate that already causes a lot of problems for us, and it already affects us. The second key message is the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees is significant. A lot of factors put together by the World Research Institute. It doesn't sound like a lot, 0.5 percent points, but it is a lot in the effect, and especially in the reduction in biodiversity. It looks like it will be 2.6 times worse than it would be with 1.5 degrees increase. So that means the European Green Deal, this is looking at the policy brief from the European Union. It's the best we have on a European level at the moment. It's 3 areas of measures. In industry, new standards, new regulations to be created, and to create them so that one large economic area has the same standards. And at the same time, there's a fiscal or tax measures, something that in Austria we've been speaking about for 30 years. And it's always something that is included in the budget and then it's taken out at the last minute. Socio-ecological taxation, they always reason that it has regressive effects, and it's something that is a serious problem, but you might be able to push the numbers around so that it wouldn't be obvious. And on a European level, it's better to have it large, but large countries like Sweden and Denmark already had this beforehand. But now it's on a European level. And then the third area of measures is the systematic evaluation matrix in terms of investments, or when should investments count as green investments and when should they not. So a systematic approach to that is the goal, and to create standards, that's something positive. And then since 1990, the European Union has reduced their emissions by 24%, and Austria has stabilized them. So Austria hasn't even achieved the European average. Austria is always catching up in this area, and has always been. The European Union is now starting with power stations, factories, ships, aeroplanes, and heating systems to bring them into a systematic framework so they can be regulated. It's better than what we had so far, but I agree with my predecessor that it's not enough, because there's always it's called a climate safety program, a climate protection program, but it's also presented as a growth program. And so it's the same with your idea of the train. You're trying to reduce emissions, but on the other hand, you're seemingly increasing them as well. So if we look at economic growth of 3%, as mentioned before, we would hope that emissions and use of materials is is hopefully going to be reduced. We notice that over the years, over decades, we use materials more efficiently than in the 70s, for example, and that's positive, but it's not enough, because continuously anything that we have saved, economized, it's something that we're just using more in the end by producing more. So it's something that is cancelling each other out, and that's why ecological economics is started. It was started as an idea because you only think about improving efficiency, effectiveness, and then it's 2 thumbs up, but it's not positive for the planet. And the planet cares about the absolute values, and that's why we have to think about ecological economics. And that's something that has to be added to the economic evaluations that we make. And in the past, if we look at the growth programs of the European Union, green areas were always in the rhetoric, but not in the results. So if we look at the impacts from the past, these are some results from Ms. Nakvi and Ms. Zwickel. Sorry, I didn't translate this slide, but this is information from 2 colleagues of mine. These 2 blocks show how a decoupling of emissions is successful from economic growth. So from 0, there is a decoupling. With 1, we have a perfect decoupling at point 1, and that's something that we want. So the higher the block is, the better. Under 0, we would be looking at an increased amount and inefficiencies. So thankfully, that's something we don't have. We're above 0, so it's a better effectiveness, but we're not at the level 1. So it's looking at two time periods here. So 95 to 2015 is the red block. So that's 1995 to 2015 in the red block. That's 20 years. And there's a significant amount of decoupling that is achieved in this area. So for every product produced, there is less materials or less emissions consumed or produced. And then in 2008 to 2015, so that's a part of that time period. So after the financial crisis, after various growth programs, that's something that cancelled itself out a little bit, because we were looking much more in the area of GDP, and so the economy has to look at, or economists have to look at different parts of data. So it's not just about CO2, of course, where it's problematic. It's about other emission areas as well, with other dimensions, where in economic programs to support the economy, the previous advantages were wiped out. So we didn't have a European Green Deal, we didn't have climate legislation, but the danger is there. That's me speaking as a dentist again. And so what do we need? We need a mobilization of players, and we need regulation. Regulation is not a dirty word in my mind. We can only function properly in economies if we regulate them. Markets are made up of rule books and standards. So a market that works without rules, there is no free market. It's just absurd, that idea. And we have different rule books for different markets, and we have to check whether those rules are adequate for the problems that are faced by those markets. And if not, then we have to think about which rules have to be changed, maybe on a European level. A lot is already happening in that area, but we need more, especially if we are looking at taxation of wealth, not directly and not indirectly through GDP might be able to create a change. And then if we only look at GDP and about increasing GDP, that's an invention of the 20th century. That's something that people didn't really think about. People were thinking more about requirements that they might have. And just this idea of increasing output is because populations were increasing. And now we have stagnating population rates, and we still are looking at increasing GDPs. It's more of a religion. I don't mind increasing GDP. I think it would be great if we can create economic growth in the systems that we have, if they work better, because they would have these rule books that can allow for economic growth within these systems and rules. The biophysical limits have to be taken serious, and we have to respect the limits that we believe are true. So it's worth thinking about which social institutions, which rule books in labor markets, in financial markets, would work if we have to think about living without economic growth. It's something we want to think about, what we want, what kind of alternative orientation is possible. And that's what we're talking about when we think the buzzword is bouncing forward. We're thinking about innovation and even ex-novation. So what don't we need anymore? Well, what is not valued by society anymore? What could we get rid of? So the supplier industry for fossil fuel motors, in Germany especially, that is something that is being pulled towards the German industry. It's a big problem, but at the same time, these fossil fuel motors, they don't really help us in what we're trying to achieve in the next couple of years, combustion engine motors. And it's something that we want to look at. How can we rebuild this? How can we reinvent ourselves in a regional area? That's the term ex-novation. And what I think we need is a change in paradigms. For Europeans, this is a topic that has definitely arrived in our minds. In various formulations of wordings of these questions, Europeans always answer more than 70% that they approve of these climate positive measures and ideas. What do we need if we want to have a climate positive society? It has to meet the requirements of all people, and that's something that isn't achieved by any country at the moment. So we're looking at a maximum level of energy consumption, the 1.5 global increase in temperature goal, and it means we need a profound transformation of energy systems. We know human requirements, we know which goods, which services, and which conditions those requirements need to be met with. And then if we look at the question, which socio-ecological conditions enable societies to meet these human requirements in order to have a low energy consumption as well. And that's something that is limited by planetary systems combined with social goals, and we need these the minimum social requirements. And the countries, the life satisfaction, nutrition and sanitation, those are all goals, that's all part of it, but it's not only that, of course.
No, this refers to Bangladesh. It is not very surprising. It is not surprising that the minimum standards have not been achieved. This is why the inner circle is red and not blue. Red means we have not achieved the minimum standards. But on the other hand, which is rather positive, is that planetary limits are not exceeded in Bangladesh. but social minimum levels have not been achieved. So this is not a success model. This is not what we want to do, but we have to help the people in Bangladesh to improve their social conditions. Now, this refers to Albania. To be a poor country does not mean that you do not exceed planetary limits. So here, once again, social minimum standards have not yet been achieved and planetary limits have already been exceeded. And this is the situation in Austria. The social minimum standards have been achieved. That is positive news. And we heard that over the last 200 years, this has been achieved by way of discussion, by way of negotiations. But the problem still exists that we have not achieved everything we need. So that means there's not a single country where we can say, oh, this is now a model country. But what we have to do is to try and look for a new pathway. What are the approaches that are very successful or very much known? 50 years ago, an Austrian minister for environment said, if we change a little bit our daily lives, then we will do a lot for climate protection. If everybody does so, then we will have no problems anymore. Okay, we no longer believe that there's not enough information. Information is, of course, important, but it is not sufficient to change the behavior, and also the highly individual approaches are also not very productive, and we've come away from that. That has been corroborated in many studies. Now, sufficiency means to look at what is sufficient when we set up the national climate plans for the European EU member countries. We looked at this point, and it may be surprising that in the Austrian and in other climate plan, although we criticized the Austrian plan, we found a lot of sufficient measures. They will never be implemented as such, but there are certain measures for sufficiency. So these are very small approaches onto which we can build. Now, once again, we had a survey in European-wide survey, and the majority of European citizens understand how important climate protection measures are, and they try to live accordingly. Of course, an improved technology is something that anybody would like to have. Nobody will be against that, but unfortunately, that is not sufficient. And what I'm going to cover in the next 5 minutes is another approach, which I think is much more productive. That is supply systems and satisfaction for everybody. Those two approaches have been included in the speech by von der Leyen. But they are going into a slightly different direction, and it is not really clear within which paradigms these measures are incorporated. Supply system. For me, economics is a science of provisions. So that is a science which makes sure that we have enough supply systems or provision systems. That refers to the distribution of consumer goods within economy and services within economy. So what it is about is to satisfy human needs, the needs of everybody, but there are different satisfiers. That means there are different systems which respond to these needs, and supply system try to combine the use of resources and satisfaction of needs. Now, humane needs are finite. They can be classified, and the basic needs have been the same throughout all cultures and throughout all different societies in history. No, there are differences as to what people think about how to satisfy these needs, but the basic needs are always the same. They do not change from one year to the next, but they do remain in place, like, for example, appropriate provisions of water and of food and freedom and other factors. Now, there has been a study which was published a short while ago by Vogel, Steinberger and O'Neill. They looked at the socio-economic conditions for satisfying the human needs in the area of low energy use. And they asked themselves, what is the relationship between energy consumption and the satisfaction of human needs by taking into account the different supply factors and the configuration of these factors. And the study showed that in 77 of 106 countries, the basic needs of people have not been satisfied to a large extent, while in 29 countries where these needs have been sufficiently satisfied, there is not a sufficiently high level of sustainable energy use. That means they simply use too much energy. So that means that structures have to change, the structures of institutions, the factors of supply, and we can make a distinction between positive and negative suppliers. And then the positive suppliers are those which improve the quality of public services, which overcome the difference in incomes levels, which promote democracy and access to electricity. And as well as satisfying the basic needs, they use less energy. On the other hand, economic growth outside a moderate level of wealth are linked to a lower satisfaction and a lower need of satisfaction. So are there any obstacles in the way of satisfying low energy needs? While there are some countries where there is a positive configuration of provision, they will be able to satisfy human needs by using very low levels of energy. But there are other factors which are much more specific, which have been identified, and the study looked at other works of literature. They looked at, for example, luxury consumption, overproduction, overconsumption, strive for wealth. All these are factors which contribute to that. An approach as to how to implement social systems of supply and provision. I don't exactly corroborate this view, but I nevertheless think that the opinion of universal basic services goes into the right direction. It is not a completely new idea because it is based on the spirit of the New Deal by the US President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The framework for political action and for a sustainable consumption corridor is to be set up, and that has to relate to public services in the first place. So what does it mean to have a climate compatible society? It means that we have to completely transform the economic system so that human needs can be satisfied without at the same time using the same amount of energy. The main pillars of the changes which are required counteract the current political and economic system, and these obstacles have to be overcome. Universal basic provision is not one individual political measure, but it is a framework which offers the pathway for political decisions in different areas. And I think this is an approach that would very well fit into the context of Austria. Thank you very much for listening.